I'd like to thank our top sponsors, Marcella Chiriac, Odd Nerdrum, Anders Berger Christiansen, and Joanna Cordos for making this show possible. And welcome to the 17th episode of The Cave of Apelles. My guest for the evening is a philosopher with a punchline. Only the potential of improvement can give your life meaning. His proposition has become a controversial one in today's culture. Objective values and criteria exist, independent of subjective preferences. Einar Duenger Bøhn, welcome to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you for having me.
So, your book, The Meaning of Life, is the reason why you're sitting in that chair right now. And interestingly enough, you actually wanted on the front page of this book the Sisyphus painting by Tëchne. And Sisyphus obviously was one of the sinners of Greek mythology, and he was punished quite severely in the underworld. So before we get to the topics for the evening, why don't you just recap what the myth of Sisyphus is?
So the myth of Sisyphus comes in many varieties. The way it's been used in philosophy is so we just take it and use it for our own purpose. So we don't really care about the original sources for what exactly happened in this myth, but the way we've used it is as this there's this guy Sisyphus who he loves life so much. So when he's about to die and the gods come to pick him up to send him to the kingdom of death, he refuses, and he tricks the gods into letting him stay on earth for longer. He also gets picked up by the gods, but then he convinces them to go back down on earth to talk to his wife, because he was going to yell at her for not doing it right. His funeral, I think it was, or something. So he goes back down, and then he fools them again, so they can't come pick him up. So he keeps wanting to stay alive, basically. Right. I think he ties one of the gods to the ground even at some point. So after having fought for his life for so long, the gods get fed up, and they just pick him up with force, and he's punished to this existence of rolling a rock up a hill just to see it roll back down. So every time he rolls it up, it rolls back down. And he has to go back down and pick it up and roll it back up again and again. And not only that, but he has to do this for all eternity.
Right.
And so that's the myth, the way philosophers have described it. And the reason we're interested in this myth is because it's a picture of a meaningless existence, right, or a meaningless labor. So this is where the concept Sisyphus work come from.
Right. And you use that quite prominently in your book.
Yeah, so this is a case for, this is a picture of an existence where you do something that's futile. It doesn't lead to anything. It's pointless.
Yeah.
And he has to do it forever. So it never leads to anything. So the question philosophers have asked is, well, if this is a case of meaningless existence or a meaningless life, two questions are important. One is, how much does it look like our life? Like, how much does our life actually reflect like this? And we go to work every day. Some of us have kids, we get a job, work for a bunch of years, then we die. And our kids repeat the cycle. Or just every day, you get up, you get your breakfast, you go to work, you go home, you watch some TV, and then you go to bed and you redo the same thing. So at what level and to what extent do our lives look like this? Because if this is a meaningless existence, then our lives is a meaningless existence. But the other question is, what do we have to add to this existence to gain meaning? So if we want to consider a meaningful life, what is it that's missing in Sisyphus' existence? Because if it is meaningless, what can we add to make it meaningful? So that's sort of the way we've treated the myth, and that's how I use it in the book.
Right. And I think that's in your book, isn't it? That you've had experience of talking about objective values in order to create meaning in life. you've been accused of holding authoritarian and dangerous ideas, and I guess it doesn't get much better when you prefer figurative painting such as Odd Nerdrum and claiming that modernism or art, as I would say, makes life meaningless, right? However, it's easy to get confused as a painter, and when we're talking about painting, when evasive concepts like, my expression or it does something to me are used as objective signifiers of quality. And if you throw in identity politics and accusations of Eurocentrism, it doesn't, it can get quite ugly. And I think this is why we have these illustrations on the wall and on the shelf here to be able to see if we're able to tie what you're saying about objectivity into sculpture, into painting in this case. And just to be clear, the image to the left there is a Japanese sculpture from the 12th century of a Buddhist monk. And I can tell you, European sculpture was not at that level at that time. An amazing thing. And this is a Nigerian figure from the 14th century. And I just love the fact that, if you have the Gombric version of art history, then the thing you see are the masks, that Picasso was concerned with. But you don't see that actually they were doing this as well. So they sort of placed into what you're saying about objectivity. It's not just some subjective idea, right? And this is also why it's so refreshing to hear that you speak of skill not only as a technical concept, but as a sort of sign of symbolist, a symbol of humanism. I'm sorry. So if we get to your book proper, your idea when we were going back and forth about this conversation is that we should start with some definitions here in a true philosopher manner.
Yeah.
So, shoot.
So good philosophy always starts with clarifying the question we're interested in.
Right.
I think it's important to know what we're trying to answer before we try to answer it.
Good idea.
I think that's a good start. So the question of the meaning of life, for example, if we start with that, is a big question. It's like the question. So what do we mean by it? And I think it's important to clarify exactly. So we can mean many things with that question. I think it's important to clarify exactly what I mean by it and what I think is the most important meaning of the question. And a couple of very important distinctions is when I ask about the meaning of life, I want to know what the point of going on with life is. So why should I get up another day just to repeat the cycle? Why should I continue living, basically? That's the question I'm interested in. So what's the point of going on? And that's very important to be clear on what that doesn't ask. So it doesn't ask about the cause of our existence. So why are we here? So when you wonder about the meaning of life, it's tempting to ask the question, why are we here? Right?
Yeah, that's...
You look up at the sky and they say, where will it end if I go straight? And why the hell am I here? But those are different questions. Those are questions about the cause, so the origin of life. And there can be many theories of that, but I'm not interested in that for this purpose, because I think whatever the cause is, whether it's an accident, whether it's God, intentional action, whether it's a big bang in physical theory, whatever it is that caused our existence, ultimately, we can still ask, okay, so we're here for that cause, but what's the point of continuing being here? That's still a legitimate question. And that's the question I'm interested in. So why should I go on? When I get up in the morning, why should I do it? Why should I get up? And I think that's the important question. So we're not asking about the cause. So we leave that behind. Another question we're not asking is, what's the intention? So a lot of people, when talk about the meaning of life, they sort of presuppose that we're asking about what the point is in the sense of what's the intention behind our existence, i.e. supposing something like a divine intention. I'm not interested in intention either. I think it's a different question, because whether or not there is an intention behind our existence, we can still ask, why should we go on with this intention, right? So if God created us and He's the cause, and He had an intention with our existence, I can still ask, what's the point for us to keep fulfilling or trying to fulfill this intention? Is it a good intention? Is it a bad intention? So if God was evil and He had His plan was just to watch ourselves torture each other, I would ask, what's the point of this? right? The intention in the sense of the meaning of life in the sense of intention will be to torture each other then.
Right.
But I would be asking, why should we keep doing this? What's the point? And so that's the question I'm interested in. So it's independent of the intention. So if you separate out cause and you separate out intention, then you start to see more what we're looking for. We're looking for a question, a reason or a point of going on, keep living. That's the question we're interested in. So that clarifies a little bit what kind of questions. But I'm just going to go on with a couple more concepts. They're very important.
Yeah, because you're separating the meaning of life also from similar concepts that you would think are identical.
So I've done this, like I've talked about this for 10 years now. So I know a lot of the confusions that come up in conversation with different people, both academics and artists and what I call ordinary people. So there's a lot of concepts that get confused, like cause and intention, for example.
Yeah.
But other concepts are happiness.
Right. So I talk about states of mind.
Yeah. So a lot of people think that the meaning of life, well, it's just to be happy. A lot of people say that. But I think that's false, and I'll illustrate that with a case. But before that, think also of happiness and think of being moral. A lot of people think also, well, just behave nice. The point is just to do good things, right? And be moral, act well towards each other. But I think these are different concepts. So think of, and I think in this case, painters and artists are good illustrations of why these concepts are different. Because so I read this biography of Van Gogh, the painter, and it's pretty clear when you read that biography that he was not very moral, he was not happy, but he was intensely obsessed with painting. And what's the point for him to get up in the morning? Well, it's not to be happy. That was not what was driving him. And it wasn't even a point, I think, for him to search for it necessarily. It was not to be moral either, but it was to improve his paintings, to work on his paintings. So art was sort of like the point for him to get up. He wanted to make another painting or a better painting. And I think this illustrates by anyone who is passionate about something. You know, artists, painters, authors, scientists, anyone who really work on a project, is what this illustrates is that you can be really unhappy and you can be immoral. But the reason or the point for you to keep doing what you're doing could be that it's very meaningful. It's a different concept. These cases show that you can have meaning without happiness or morality, for example, which illustrates that these are different concepts. They might coincide and come together sometimes, but they don't have to. That's the point. So these are separate concepts. Like if I look at my life when I do philosophy, I find it very meaningful, but morally, I probably ought to spend more time with my family, for example, often. It certainly doesn't make me happy. Never been happy. It's not what I'm pursuing. I think happiness is overrated, to be honest. It's like my cat. When I strike my cat and it purrs louder every time I touch it, I feel like that cat must be really happy. But lying there for a long time makes me think it's pointless. It's meaningless. The cat's life is sort of meaningless. So I think these kind of cases illustrate that these are different concepts. So what we're looking for is a point to go on, and that doesn't have to be happiness or morality or many other concepts. I think it's a distinctive concept that has its own kind of identity. And you can see this with a bunch of authors, for example, who keep writing books and they're immoral and they're unhappy, but they keep doing it. Why? Well, because it's meaningful to do it. That sort of justifies why they're doing it. They can do it and be immoral, and it is immoral what they're doing often. But anyway, still, it's meaningful. It's just a conflict between these values. And I think meaning can explain and justify to some extent why they're doing what they're doing.
Right.
So these are different concepts. So I think we must focus on meaning as a point of going on with something. And that's the question we're looking for when we ask, what's the meaning of life? It's the point of going on. It doesn't have to be morality, or it doesn't have to be happiness, I think. But we want a point to going on. And what I go on to say is that being moral, for example, is meaningful. But there are also meaningful things that aren't moral. Or being happy is a meaningful activity. But there are also things that are meaningful that doesn't make you happy.
Right.
So it's a broader category, meaning. And when you look at your own life and all the important decisions you've made, like why you went to school, why you got the job you did, why you moved where you did, why you got married, why you had kids, why you pursue the project you do, these big decisions, I bet it's never, ever justified by morality. Very rarely do someone say, I got married for moral reasons. That sounds terrible, right? Or I got married because I think it makes me happy. That's a little bit better, but I think still it's sort of like weird. Or I pursue my job because of moral reasons. Sometimes that might be true, but I think what also drives it is that it's meaningful. Right. And certainly in many cases you can say, I do this because it's so meaningful, even though I might morally have done something else, or I might have done something else to be happy. Right. So I think this illustrates that meaning is a broader, different category than happiness and morality, for example. Yeah.
And a major term that you use is the idea of improvement.
Yeah.
So, and you're saying that it doesn't necessarily have to, it's not the end result you're talking about, but the fact that you're trying to improve.
Yeah, so I mean, that's sort of the answer to the question. So if we clarify the question to see what it means, I sort of give the answer that the meaning, the point of going on with life is the potential for improvement. So the fact that we can make things better, and by better I mean as broadly as possible. I don't mean morally better, right? That would collapse back to morality. So the potential for improvement, that's what gives you a point to keep going with life. I think that's like a point that's common to everything that's we say is meaningful, is the potential to improve. So imagine the opposite, the reverse. So if you do something and there's no potential for improvement, that's sort of like pointless. Right. So if you go back to Sisyphus and you consider his situation, a reason that it feels pointless is that there's no room for improvement. He just keeps rolling the rock, and it's not leading to anything, it's not making any improvements, it's not doing anything, it's futile, and that's pointless. So if you add a potential for improvement in Sisyphus' condition, that would give him a point to keep going. So I think that's sort of the answer to the question, actually. What's the meaning of life? The potential for improvement. Right. That's the reason and point to go on.
And I wanted then to bring up something that I talked with Joachim Eriksson about, because when you're a figurative painter, if we try to take what you're saying and make it concrete for example, a figurative painter, a lot of them experience that selling is difficult. The galleries are almost all modern, and he talked about how he had these images, the paintings, still in the studio after the show. They hadn't sold. It was the best paintings they'd ever made, and then he went into gaming industry instead. Now, of course, he's still using his skills. That's much better than your typical change where people turn totally modernist or contemporary and give up their talent. But how can a painter still go on if you are improving your work, but they don't sell? Like, how do you reconcile those two?
Yeah, it's hard, because I think there are genuine conflicts of value. So this is often called value pluralism. I think there often are cases where you have some justification for doing something, but you also have justification for stop doing it. It's like you can do great art, but maybe it's immoral. And then you have moral reasons speaking against it, but you also have aesthetic reasons speaking for it. So for example, if you want to continue painting in your style and it doesn't sell, then you get economic problems. Right. And economic problems means problems with just ordinary survival. So you have prudential reasons to not go on with that painting stuff, but you also have your aesthetic and your, I think, reasons of meaning to go on with what you think authentically is what you should be doing.
Right. Because I think that
so there's a conflict.
Yeah, and I think that even though if you have to have a job on the side or whatever, just to be aware of this idea that as long as there is a potential for improvement, then it's meaningful. Yeah. Just to know that, even though you don't get to paint that much or whatever, that can help you stay mentally alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you read biographies of great people who pursued their passion or the project they pursued they pursue the project with passion throughout their lives, and they have been poor, and the contemporary society didn't recognize them, and later we recognize their genius. In these cases, why do we think it's so cool to read about these cases? Well, because he or she pursued like the project that they authentically thought was actually what they were good at, or what they thought was valuable, or what they could improve, or they sort of pursued it at the cost of popularity or ordinary survival.
Right.
So I think there's some integrity to it, and authenticity, like being authentic, being true to yourself kind of idea. I think that's why we value those things. But in practical life, in ordinary life, there's always these conflicts of value. Yeah. And most people, of course, can't live well off doing what they enjoy.
But is this, I mean, I guess that's a part of the distinction between the different terms you're using. If I, as a figurative painter, have this idea of success, or at least that I should be able to live off of my work, do I have the wrong expectations? Should I adjust my brain, what I expect to get out of it? I mean, you have Nietzsche saying that not even virtue is like a pay in itself. You should just be detached from any kind of fearing punishment or getting reward, right?
Yeah. I don't know about expectations. I think it's just a genuine conflict of values. So you have some reasons to do it, and you have some to not do it. And I think it's important to recognize that there are actually meaningful reasons for pursuing it, right? So when you do something and you think this is what really is much better than doing this, but everyone wants me to do this. Yeah. I think, as you said, it's very healthy for your psychology to realize that this is actually, there are actual justification for doing this. Right. It's not just an illusion.
And that doesn't like magically solve the problem, but at least you know what your values are, right?
Yeah, and you should pursue this. You can improve it. You're good at it. This is what you want to do, and you think it reflects on deep values, and you don't think what's expected of you do that. Yeah. You have to weigh these up against each other, and of course sometimes it might be prudentially reasonable to go for the normal existence, but there are actual justifications for pursuing a meaningful project. I think we should recognize that. And I think it's a shame when people don't recognize the actual objective justification for meaning that lies in meaning for pursuing something. I think it hinders like cultural development, to be honest.
Because speaking of that, there's some things that you write in your book, and I wanted to sort of play a bit of a devil's advocate. That when it comes to something that you're saying there that might be a problem or not be understood correctly, because you're talking about how being a part of something bigger gives meaning.
Yeah.
And well, maybe you should say a little bit about that first before I sort of try to get to...
So there's actually another distinction we might want to pull in before we go on. So there's this between subjective and objective meaning. I think is important before you do the project.
Quite important, yeah.
Being part of the bigger project. So when we talk about meaning and talking about the meaning of life, the point of going on, a lot of people confuse the subjective and the objective distinctions. So let me say what that means. So on the one hand, people say, well, what's meaningful to you doesn't have to be meaningful to me. So we can have disagreements about what we find meaningful, what we experience as meaningful. So for example, I experience it's meaningful to do philosophy. I experience it as very meaningful to be at a coffee shop and just sit there for hours watching people. I find that very meaningful. Other people don't find that meaningful. They don't experience that as meaningful. They experience it as a waste of time. These are subjective experiences of meaning that differs from person to person. And that's not what I'm interested in, right? The question, because that you can take with your friends and family and a shrink. Like what you experience is meaningful. I can't really help you from here. Right. We need to talk about that later. But I think what the question is more interesting sense of the question is, what is actually the meaning of going on? Not just what do we experience as meaningful. So I think we can be mistaken about what's meaningful. So as a teenager, I found something meaningful, and I think today that I was wrong about that. and I think we can correct each other. So I think what some people do is actually more or less pointless a lot of the times. And I think that they're wrong. So I think they can be corrected on what they experience as meaningful. I can't tell them that they're not experiencing it as meaningful, because they are experiencing it. Yeah. But what they're experiencing is actually not meaningful. And this goes for all kinds of value judgments. This goes for ethics, for example. You can do something and think you're doing the right thing, but actually realize later or be told by others that you're doing something wrong. So you can be corrected. And this makes it more objective. So it doesn't make it just dependent on my experience, but it makes it actually being correctable. And I think this goes for meaning as well as morality, as well as art judgments. I think there are objectivity involved. And this lies at the foundation of this question that I'm interested in, this meaning of life, theory of meaning of life as objective potential for improvement. There has to be some objectivity to it. Because if I'm being told that just experience something as meaningful, if I worry, or when I worry that life is pointless all the time, when I worry about that and someone says, well, just find something you like, doesn't really help, right? Because I might be wrong. I want to know that what I like doing or what I am doing is actually meaningful. I don't want to just feel it's meaningful. That's like taking a pill and living on an illusion. That's not satisfying to me. That's not satisfying to me as a philosophical question. It might help me for my personal well-being. I might feel better or make a better life for me, but it's not answering the question of what the point of going on is. So I'm very interested in this objectivity in meaning. And then we get to the being part of a bigger project. So I think meaning is a lot like true love. So if you think of love, true love, not the kind of passionate desire for someone that you have in the beginning, but like true love like you have for your family or for your children. What that involves is that it's a relation I have towards another person. And I have love for my son, for example, and that involves that I sometimes go out of my way to make sure my son is better off. So I do stuff and I feel stuff that's directed towards him having it better or being better off. So if I did it for the reason that if I helped him because it made me feel better, that wouldn't be acting out of love. That would be acting out of selfish desire. But if I do something for him so he can feel better, that would be acting out of love. So this is a directed towards something else kind of relation. And I think meaning is like that. So when if you take painting as an example, so when Van Gogh was pursuing painting as a project, so the last 10 years of his life he was just painting like insanely intense. What the meaningful aspect here is that you have to feel part of this project that's bigger than yourself. So if he was painting just to feel better, that would be sort of odd. But if he was painting, or pointless if you ask me, almost pointless. But if he was painting to pursue the art of painting, and he was trying to make painting better, and he's directed to that, just like love is directed to another person, meaning would be directed to a project that you want to fulfill or you want to improve. That's sort of like a true dimension of meaning, I think. That's sort of like there's actual potential for improvement and you're pursuing it, and it's not about you, but it's about the thing you're actually pursuing. So it could be a lot of things. It doesn't have to be painting, but it has to be something external to you. It has to be something bigger. And when you're part of that and you're pursuing that and you're trying to improve it, then you sort of look back and say, that was meaningful. But the paradox is that you can't think it when you're pursuing it. So if you go into the studio to paint a painting in order to feel meaningful, it's not going to work. So you need to just focus on your painting and make sure you paint a great painting. And when you've done that, you can look back and say, that was meaningful.
But it's
sort of like it has to be directed to something. That's sort of a picture.
Yeah, and I'm thinking what I thought when you wrote that, when I read that, is that it's very important, especially for someone working in a classical manner, whatever discipline, to really be conscious about his or her ethics. And I'm more, my vantage point is Ayn Rand's idea of definition of egoism, is that doing something which is beneficial to yourself long term. Yeah. So helping your son is then egoistic because that's something that has a very high value for you, right? But if you should take it down to painting proper, a problem might be if someone reads your book and then thinks the point is to be altruist, to sacrifice the thing that you really like to do. So that if you have that altruist attitude, you are quite easily a victim of just doing whatever anyone else does. Because the whole metaphysics is that I cannot put myself first, I have to serve something greater. Do you see that as a danger or?
Yes, I mean, so it depends. So I agree with the altruism danger, but I don't agree with the stuff you said about egoism. So we can talk a little bit about that, because I think if you're thinking of altruism in the sense of I want to do things that make other people feel good, right? Or I want to do things that make us all feel good. Then by altruistic reasons, you might adapt to your local community, which you don't really want to do, right?
Right.
So you pursue like modernistic art because everyone else is doing it and everyone's happy.
Yeah, that's the
that's sort of like the altruistic danger.
Yeah.
But I think I agree with that. So in that sense, you should maybe, for reasons of meaning, at least, if not for altruistic or moral or happiness, for reasons of meaning, you might go. It might be that you should pursue what you want to pursue, and in that sense, it's more selfish, right? So you go for classic figurative painting instead of modernistic, more abstract painting, for example. So there might be reasons for pursuing your own selfish stuff instead. But I think there are different notions of selfishness here. So by selfish, I meant that you pursue something just to satisfy your own desires. Right, if that's the main motivation, then I think the narcissist will never achieve meaning.
Right, I think that, Ayn Rand talks about long-term rational,
so I think
that's not what you're talking about right now.
So I think the immediate satisfaction of your own desires is sort of like the narcissist picture of selfish action. Yeah. And that's not going to give you meaning, I think. But it might be selfish to pursue painting, for example, or the style you like. It might be selfish in the sense that you're doing something that you want to do at the cost of what everyone else wants to do, right? So in that sense, it might be selfish rather than altruistic. But I think in order to achieve meaning to it, you can't be thinking about your own immediate desires. You need to be thinking about the discipline or the art or
you have to relate to
the tradition you want to pursue.
Speaking of objective qualities, it's not because I feel something here, but there are certain objective standards that I want to go by because they fit with my values. They have a very high value for me. Yeah. Because of in
that sense, it's not selfish, because you're actually seeing values in the tradition that the others aren't or don't like, and you're pursuing it. It doesn't have to be selfish, because you're actually pursuing something other than yourself. You're pursuing values or objective values or a tradition in which it doesn't have to make you feel good necessarily. You can feel miserable your entire life and still have had a meaningful life.
But that's where I think you're dead, spot on, not dead. You're spot on. You're dead on. Spot on when it comes to that the meaning of life is you have that when you are able to improve something. Yeah. And okay, so I think we just kind of say that we disagree with or work with different ideas of egoism. Yeah. But what I see then, if you stick to the sort of the altruist side of it, which is the main thing I was interested as a possible problem here. I've talked to painters. There's hundreds of thousands of stories about that. One painter was here, a really good painter, talked about how when he was in the university, and you get that pressure, modernist or art pressure. He painted a portrait, and he got really freaked out because he felt that this was too sentimental. That's the way one thinks at present, and so he painted white stripes over it, and that's a problem if you are used to thinking I should not judge, but I should be part of something greater. Then that's sort of the flip side of it, right?
No, absolutely. And I think it's a conflict of what you call altruism or adjusting or adapting to your environment versus pursuing what you think is better. And I think it's a constant battle. I don't think it just goes for art. I think it goes in academia. It goes in everyday life, basically. So I have this Viking tunica that I really like to wear, but I'm sort of like, I'm not wearing it at the store. because I feel weird, but I really like to wear it at home. And that's just a case where like I sort of like have conflict of interest. I sort of wish I could use it all the time, but then I adjust a little bit to expectations from the environment around me. When I pick my kids up at school, I don't wear it, right? So it's sort of like I'm just adjusting, and I think that goes for ordinary stuff like that, as well as for internal to art disciplines, as well as internal to academia, everywhere. There's this conflict, but I think we should recognize the value of the point of doing something that might be cutting across all these expectations and reasons from others, and there might be objectively good reasons for doing something that goes against all those contemporary trends or
because
expectations.
A problem could be, speaking of Sisyphus, if you are, not in the sense that you are talking about it obviously, but if you are then altruistically concerned with denigrating yourself, I have to live for something bigger because I'm not nothing, whatever. This idea can lead to passivity, right? The general thing you can often hear figurative painters say when it comes to the situation, which is not exactly on the table for figurative painting, they will say, "Oh, just paint. Forget the critics. Just paint." Yeah. And I'm thinking if you're Sisyphus in that context, and you're carrying that rock up on the hill, and it rolls down again, and you just see the rock rolling, and you get completely frustrated. Yeah. But you don't look around and see, well, here's an art critic pushing the rock down again. Maybe you should deal with him instead of the rock. You understand that what I'm saying there?
No.
That if you are too much concerned with the idea of living for something bigger than yourself, then you don't really take control over what is the real problem.
Yeah, so you need to get the scope right. So if you think too big, like I want to just improve everything, then the expectation from others might take over or something.
Right.
Yeah, you need to focus on. So you need to have to focus on like this particular project where you find potential for improvement, and it could be very narrow. Like I've brewed my own beer recently over the last year. I find that very meaningful to improve my beer brewing. So every time I brew another, what's it? The word patch. I think it's when it gets better. I'm like, this is very meaningful. I love doing this. And it could be bigger, like writing books or doing my university job, or it could be like becoming the greatest painter of all time. It could be at all different levels. But I think you need to focus. So if you think I want to improve, the world, that might be too broad, because then you might have to adjust to everyone around you. You might have to follow expectations from others to improve their lives, and then it becomes very complicated. So I think it's if I understood you right, I think you need to focus on a particular thing. So imagine like Sisyphus. If he decided all of a sudden that he was going to poke fun at the gods and he was going to just totally enjoy rolling that rock, because they wanted him to have this terrible destiny because of what he did. So if he for a moment, tried to improve his rock rolling, he was just like, I'm going to sing along when I roll that rock. I'm going to, make it more round so it's easy to roll. I'm going to improve everything around my situation and just get more fit. I'm going to enjoy it. And he just pursues it every time with a new, drive to do better. And he can do it to some extent. He can roll it better or find ways for it to be easier to carry up there. And if you tried that for a while, I would say that's sort of a point to go on, right? It's tiny, but it makes the situation a little bit better. I think it makes it a little bit more meaningful. And in that sense, he found potential for improvement that would make his life more meaningful. But if you saw like an art critic rolling a rock on the other hill, and they together decided to do something, maybe that would make it more, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I guess my point was rather that if you are not concerned with that I can have a better situation, then you can easily miss that the reason why you're in a miserable situation can, if you just change your angle a bit, be easily solved. and you attack the problem and not the symptom of it, right? Right. I mean, it's like to take the story literally.
Yeah.
The rock rolls down again. What if it doesn't roll down by itself? What if someone is pushing it down all the time? Maybe you want to address that person who does that, right?
Yeah. Take the problem at the root.
Yeah, right. But in this context,
But what if that person was wrong? So like the person who was pushing it down, or you want to take the problem by the root, right? What if the root was the wrong reason? The better reason was to not approach the problem that way.
Well, at least consider it, I would say.
Yeah, maybe.
But then we get to the idea of virtue, or Tëchne is the term that you've been talking about, the Greek term Tëchne. So can you define that for us? So
Tëchne is a very messy concept actually, but where I pick it up is from Aristotle.
Yeah. And I want to get to the objectivity in painting, in sculpture.
So if you talk about objectivity in art, for example, and Tëchne is this concept where it's an old Greek concept from where Plato and Aristotle discusses a lot, and Aristotle defines it as it's an intellectual virtue actually, and it's a kind of skill that you have. It's a skill to produce something. But not just produce it, but produce it with what he calls a true concept. So you want to produce something with a true concept. When you're able to produce something with a true concept, you have Tëchne. And the way I think to understand it is when you have the skill to produce something in a good way, so you have a goal of producing something and you know how to produce it well, then you have Tëchne. So it could be, building a house, for example. When you want to build a house and you know how to do it well, then you have Tëchne in house building. But there are 2 degrees to it. So one is the person who makes the house, and he knows how to do it, but he doesn't really know the principles or the reasons why he does everything he does along the way. He's just like the carpenter that does what he's learned, but he doesn't really know why he's doing what he's doing. He has Tëchne to some degree, more like a crafts work kind of Tëchne. But there's also a higher degree, according to Aristotle, where you know how to build a house well, for example, but you also know why you put everything where you put it when you do it. So you know the principles behind why you're doing it. So you have the knowledge, and I think that's what it means by having the true concept or the knowledge behind what you're doing.
So an equivalent to that would be, for example, if a figurative painter knows how to get the color and proportions correctly, but that's like the extent of the knowledge. That is something completely different than from understanding what the larger point of painting is, for example, than storytelling.
Yeah, the larger point, but also why you put this paint here and this here, why you make this light and this dark, why you make this warm and this cold. You know the principles behind what you're doing when you do it, then you have a higher form of Tëchne, according to Aristotle. So I can learn the basic stuff of painting. You can teach me how to do it, basically, but you would still know a lot more about why we do each things we do, when we do it. So you would have a higher degree of Tëchne, a higher degree of that intellectual virtue than I would have, according to Aristotle.
So this is when we're talking about, or getting into objective criterias. Because if you look at Odd Nerdrum's portrait here, if you look at the Japanese figure from the 12th century, obviously from completely different times, from different cultures, but they base themselves on certain objective criteria. I mean, the most explicit ones being proportions, for example. Now, this is a sculpture, but I mean, you have painting from like I talked with Cheng Wu about Chinese painting from the 10th century rather. And there are surprising complete similarities between that and, for example, Lars Hartevig of the 1800s in Norway when it comes to how they create form. So, and how they create spatial depth, right? So those are objective criteria for how you create form throughout ages and throughout cultures.
Yeah, so those would be cases of Tëchne in the sense of like the craftsmanship that's needed. The work you have to do with your hands, the instrumental objectivity, I would call it. Like, you know how to do things to achieve certain goals. And when you know how to do it, there are objective criteria of how to, for example, create depth in the picture. You need like warm and cold against each other. You need light and dark against each other in the right combinations, and then you can create depth. Yeah, and so if you don't do that, you just don't get depth.
Yeah, and so the whole idea of, that's why I mentioned Eurocentrism. I guess you're familiar with the term, and this is also part of what we're getting to in a couple of minutes or so when it comes to defining what modernism is and did to the foundational core principles of what I call just Greek culture, right, and including then the Renaissance, Baroque, whatever. To take away all of those things that we can say with clear certainty that are objective values. But then, so you call this instrumental objectivity?
Yeah, it's sort of like half of the picture of Tëchne. So if you have full Tëchne, you have the instrumental objectivity, like you know how to do things. So if you want to build a house or a veranda, there are certain things you should do and certain things you shouldn't do in order for that house to like stand in the end. And that's objective. So if you say, I feel I don't have to do certain things, the house will fall down. So those are objective, instrumental objectivity in the Tëchne, in the crafts work, or in the, in the how you do it. But there's also, the true concept or the knowledge behind what you're doing kind of picture involved in Tëchne as well. Which is you need to know why you're doing it, when you're doing it, and how to do it. But you also need to know why you should do this at all, right? Why you should pursue this project, what the point is, what's the meaning of this project, is it meaningful? Yeah, I think that's also part of it. You need to have both, and not just the Tëchne, but you also need to know the principles behind it, including the meaning of it all. And the great artists, of course, they have both. They know why they're doing what they're doing, how they know how to do it, how to paint what they want to paint, but they also know why they should be painting in a certain way rather than another, what kind of values they want to exhibit, and what to do to be able to achieve that. So if you want to paint and show two people caring for each other, you need to do certain things to be able to paint the people caring for each other, which are instrumentally objective stuff you need to do. But also you need to know, what caring is and how to express it. You need to have this like deeper knowledge of the values you want to show with your instrumental objectivity.
So that's one part of it. You can say there are objective criteria on an instrumental level, as you say. But then there are what I would say are objective signifiers of what is an interesting or an appealing picture. And I think that the essence of it is to deal with fundamental human situations, archetypes, right? So you cannot. It's not objective in the way that technique is, because it's not material in that sense. And you can say, well, some people don't like archetypical images, but I would still say that this is a basic necessity for a human being to see your life externalized. I mean, I tend to use the example of the sick girl by Edvard Munch. You don't have to have lost a sister to be able to relate to that somehow. And there's something about the comfort or just seeing that someone has been in your situation somehow that is, I don't know, reassuring somehow. It doesn't solve the problem magically, but it's necessary. And I think that is what you could say are objective criteria of what a good work is, aside from the purely technical issue. Yeah,
so that's one way of looking at it. So the archetypes might be what I would just call it, universal, eternal ideas of the human situation.
Right.
You want to show, in a good painting, for example, you want to show some aspects of the human situation, and there are, certain technical things you should do to be able to show it, but there's also, those kinds of human situations, values that you want to exhibit in that work also needs to be considered. So you need to not only know how to paint, for example, a person touching another person, but you also need to know how to paint it such that it exhibits the value you want to exhibit in the touching. Not just that they're touching. That would be boring. So there's two sides to it. There's the instrumental objectivity, but there's also the reasons and ideas behind it. And I think if you have a fully loaded concept of Tëchne, it involves both. And I think that's super important for meaning, just to connect it to the initial point. I mean, I think that's super important for meaning, because that gives a point to keep doing this.
Right.
And I think if we dropped the values I want to exhibit and just painted two people touching, I wouldn't see the point of it.
Yeah, and I think
and if I just wanted to exhibit the value but didn't know how to do it, I would also be like, something's missing here. What's the point of going on? So I think you need both. I think that's very important for meaning.
And also one thing I would think about when you're talking about archetypes or eternal images, you're talking about things that don't really change or improve. You can see in Odd Nerdrum's work, you can see in Henrik Ibsen, you can see in people that really have a purpose with what they're doing, is that they keep doing the same things over and over and over and over again. There are concepts that reoccur eternally in Ibsen, and you see it in Nerdrum too. And then finally they get it. You know, they've been trying from this angle, from this angle, from this angle, and then finally it works, right? And with that sort of as an introduction, I want to come to another point that you're making in the book, which is connected to the meaning. So you're saying that the potential of improvement is the thing, not just to make more things of the same quality, not quantity, but the quality should be the thing. So if, from my vantage point, and I might just be misunderstanding what you're writing, so I'm eager to hear your response. If I, as a painter, am able to, I want to quote it from this book at some point. I had this book on the conversation with Nick Thurman. If I was able to make a self-portrait like this, or a portrait like Nerdrum's there, of the same quality, then for me that would be a huge improvement, right? Yeah. Because what you're saying could be misunderstood as long as what you do is not better than all the rest, then it's pointless. Yeah. But
so it's important actually. Some people so I've given talks on this, and I gave a talk in Sweden, and the guy in the audience said something similar. He said, well, he was an old man, and he said, well, I go to the golf court every Sunday to play golf, and it's very meaningful to me. But it's not that I get better every Sunday. I get better from playing golf. It's just that if I didn't go, I would deteriorate. I would get worse. So he just kept status quo, and that was the important part. So he didn't really improve in one sense, but he just didn't get worse. Yeah. Another way of looking at it is, as you said, you want to approach the quality of this. So you work every day to approach the quality of it. Even if you, at some point, if I was trying to approach the quality of this, it would take a long time. And then I would work on it and get up every morning trying to paint that as well as that. Even if I realize that I will never do it, it's still the potential for improvement in my painting that, is a point for me to go on.
I think that's the quote by Chesterton. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing badly.
Yeah, I mean, you approach something really great, and that's improvement in one sense. And maybe, if you think of the best portrait ever made today, maybe there's like a couple of them or one, the best ones. It's not that we all should stop trying because they're so good. That way it will never be improvement, because there might be someday that someone gets something that we didn't see in the top one, right? Right. So there's always room for improvement, both for you in your art, but also for
from objective principles.
As such. Yeah. So I mean, so if there was a perfect picture, that actually would make my theory a bit harder, because if life could become perfect, then there would be no more room for improvement, and that would sort of be like, well, what now? What's the point now? So there needs to be more room for improvement constantly, in order for there to be an ultimate point of going on. I think it's actually a bit tricky. It's a weak spot of my theory.
Well, I mean, I think you can also go into the trap of positing the idea of some ideal picture, and then the ability to actually get there, and then it's game over. I mean, I'm thinking, what if you are able to become, for example, a mediocre Hellenistic sculptor, a mediocre, just being a neutral term for something, not the worst, not the best, right? Something in the middle. Yeah. That would be an awesome feat to do that. Yeah. Right? So it's and I'm thinking also, if you find something like this Yoruba figure here from Nigeria, or the Japanese figure there. Nobody knows who made it. And you find that one figure, then you could, if the culture is really set on it, you could create a new Renaissance based on just that one figure. And let's say you are the one who made that one sort of fairly good version of what everybody else did. And that is what was found. And then the whole thing can start growing again.
Yeah. I mean, so I think there's improvement and there's sort of a relative improvement. I mean, so in our time, in our present culture, if you can become like a mediocre Renaissance painter, you would probably be the best painter in our culture. So in that sense, you're improving our culture.
Right.
You're improving the art of our culture.
I see.
But you're not improving absolutely beyond the best painting ever.
Right.
Or something like that. And it's interesting with the Greek sculptures. I mean, I suspect, some people suspect that those were just like, ordinary sculptures. And the best ones might not even be preserved.
Right.
And still they're the best we have.
Yeah.
So I think it could still be an improvement. Improvement is very dynamic here.
Right,
it's not, it's objective improvement that we're looking for, but objective improvement doesn't mean, some kind of absolute top point that no one can go beyond.
Yeah.
Objectivity doesn't have to be like that. Objectivity just means that you can actually do better than this or better than that we can be corrected.
Yeah.
That's the objectivity.
The improvement can be relative to and subjective in that sense, but you're basing yourself on objective principles.
Yeah, you can have relative objectivity. So for example, defining what a portrait is and defining a tradition of painting a portrait, you can have objective criteria for whether it's good or bad.
Right.
Given that definition.
Yeah.
But if you ask, what's the definition? What's a good portrait without telling me what a portrait is? It's sort of like I can't even start. I need that kind of definition of what it is that I'm supposed to be approaching, or which dimensions are valuable in this. Right. And that you need all the time. So you can become. There's tons of improvement for mediocre painters, and there's tons of improvement for the best painters.
Right.
And they change. They can change a bit of a style and then improve that style. It's like if you look at sports, so the world champion of running, 5 miles, it's not that his exercising or training is pointless now because he's the world champion. He's got no one to beat. So he has to just improve his own record. That's the point of him continuing. Or if he can't do that, he realizes he's getting older and he can't beat his own record anymore. It starts to become pointless, actually, to keep running.
Right,
that's the sad part. You have to become a coach, or you have to find another dimension to improve.
Right.
And you see this in rock music. You see this all the time. Old bands who had their heydays, and then they become older and they can't do it anymore, but they keep trying.
Tackle that transition.
They keep trying, and it becomes pathetic. They should do something else. And I think this is just in line with the objective improvements.
But there's another thing I was thinking about. What then do you think about the whole idea of given the criteria, which I'm saying is objective criteria, that a good sculpture, a good painting, has an archetypical element, something about even just in the gaze or in the action somehow. Is that sort of somehow contradictory to improvement? Because you're not improving the human condition, you're just getting in touch with the human condition, which is sort of the same throughout the ages.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question, but I think what you need to do is not improve the human condition or the value you want to exhibit in the painting, but you want to improve the way you do it, right? So you want to make it better, or exhibit the value even better. So if you look at this, for example, a portrait. So if you simplify and you say a portrait has 2 dimensions of value that needs to be balanced. One is it needs to look like someone to some extent. There's a dimensional degree, right? So you can have hyper-realism and you can have total abstraction. Degree of look-alike. And then there's the degree of a portrait. If you think of a portrait as also needing to show a person, you want to exhibit a personality or a person in a portrait. If you simplify and think, if this would be a definition of some kind of portrait, then you need to balance the 2, right? So you need to say, it needs to look alike to a certain extent, but if it looks too much, it becomes flat. you can't get to exhibit the emotion you want to exhibit, for example. But so you need to tone down the hyper-realism, perfectionate look-alike. But you also want to express the personality. So you want to balance the two dimensions. If you want to express the emotion or the personality on the one hand, and you want to make it look like someone on the other. So if it doesn't look like him at all, you have less of a portrait. If it looks too much, it becomes flat and you lose the personality. So you need to find that balance. And that would be a case of relative objectivity. You could define, we simplified, of course, the definition here, but it's a definition that you have, a goal that you try to achieve, and there are good and bad ways of doing it. And you need to try to find the perfect balance. And this is why you can keep doing it forever, the same portrait of the same person forever. And just try it, and everyone's like, why is he painting the same person all over again and again? Well, he's perfecting that balance maybe. And that would be a point, because all of a sudden you say, as you said earlier, I got it. That was the perfect portrait, given that simplified definition. So I think that would be a case of, it wouldn't contradict anything. It would just be a definition that you can work with and say, this is what we want to achieve. There will be objective criteria for achieving it.
Okay, are you ready for a couple of questions from the audience?
Sure, if they're not too difficult.
Well, we'll see. There's, we actually have, I think we have like 4 or 5 questions. There's one guy here who's written us via email. And he's asking about Tëchne. Is it so that one can possess knowledge without having learned this from some talent/genius?
Yes. I think so. So I mean, it's a bit ambiguous what's meant. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure either, I have to admit.
But I mean, so you can gain knowledge in many ways, just in general, without talking to geniuses. I can look at this glass and realize there's water in it. So I didn't look at it, talk to any geniuses. But if it's knowledge in the sense of Tëchne, if that's what it means, it's sort of like a knowing how to do something to achieve a certain goal in a good way. Then you can gain that, I think, without learning from or talking to or interacting with geniuses. I actually think a genius doesn't have anything to do with it. I think it's got a lot to do with practice and hard work and working and knowing what you want to achieve and then explore ways of achieving it. And you can achieve a certain level of Tëchne. So like I can build if I were to build a house, I've never done it before, wouldn't know how to do it today. And I would start out building a house, I would gain some Tëchne pretty quickly about what works and doesn't work. But eventually I would become better. But I think in order to become really good, it would be a very good thing to look at other people who built houses before you, who have done it well, and then compare yourself and learn from them. And that would certainly give you a boost in Tëchne, I think. But you can certainly gain a lot of Tëchne, a level of Tëchne, without interacting with geniuses.
But and also the concept of genius as such has been perverted. I mean, it was basically a synonym for talent. You had a genius, but you had to cultivate it, because if not, just some passive ability. Right? Yeah.
So this idea of being born a genius. So like Mozart is often considered a genius because he wrote symphonies when he was like 6 or 9, his first symphony. So he was like a child prodigy, and it was sort of like just, natural born gift of composing music that he had. But we also shouldn't forget that I'm pretty sure that Mozart exercised a lot. He practiced a lot.
He probably did.
I'm pretty sure he spent quite a few hours in front of that piano in order to compose anything. I don't think he just sat down and did the first composition. So, I mean, hard work tends to be ignored when it comes to this concept of a genius. I think geniuses are often people with a certain talent who actually works insanely hard.
Right. Okay, so here's another one that was also received via email. This is someone who has read excerpts from your book, she writes here. And I'm trying to translate here. If the synthesis of the meaning of life is objectivity, and the meaning of life is subjective, then there must be some form of objectivity in the subjective. And she uses the example, which is, I guess, quite common, of a drug addict who wants more drugs. So that would be objectively what he wants for himself. But how do you say that this is not objectively good, and etc.?
I'm not sure I understood. So there's this one idea of subjective meaning, which is just what I experience as meaningful.
Yeah.
And then there's objective meaning, which is what's actually meaningful,
right,
independently of my experience.
Right.
Now, there's a way of twisting a little bit with these words where we say, well, if I experience painting as meaningful, then isn't it objectively meaningful, or isn't it objective that I experience painting as meaningful, right? And the answer is yes. If I experience something as meaningful, it's an objective fact that I experience it as meaningful. But that doesn't mean that what I experience as meaningful is actually meaningful.
Right.
Right. So those are different things. Those are different things.
I think that's a good answer, because you have to stick to a very general answer in such a question.
Yeah. So like I experience sitting at a coffee shop as meaningful. That's my experience of meaning subjectively in my life, and so it's an objective fact that I experience that as meaningful.
Right.
Because it's a fact.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that sitting at coffee shops is actually meaningful.
Right. So here's a live question from Odd Nerdrum. How does our time, the 21st century, compare to other times when it comes to individual happiness and meaningfulness?
Yeah, it's
you have 2 seconds to answer that question.
It's a tough one. And it's also more or less an empirical question.
Right.
In one sense. I mean, how does it actually compare?
Right.
But it might... If the question is something like, what are we thinking of meaning? What do we experience as meaningful, and so on? It's an empirical question. But if the question is, what is actually the point of going on across different times, then it's not an empirical question. Then it's more or less a conceptual question of what the meaning is across time.
And that would be the same at all times.
And that would be the same at all time, and that would be my answer.
Okay.
Potential to improve things. So I think for the Greek people, Greek sculptures, the point of them going on was to improve that sculpture in that very discipline. The point of other things to do back then was to improve stuff, improve democracy, or improve the situation of the slaves. I don't know what the point were. And I think the same point holds today. Yeah. But there's a difference in to what extent, and that might be what he's insinuating. Like there's a difference to what extent we are realizing that potential, to what extent we're achieving that meaning, and to what extent we're actually living in accordance with that meaning. And I think there are some aspects of like the Renaissance culture that achieved and lived in accordance with, to a greater degree, meaning than we do today. Right. So I think they achieved and they lived in accordance with meaning in some areas to a greater extent than we do today. So like when I see people in popular culture, I'm just sad. And when I see I really like this new artist in the Renaissance now, Andrea del Sarto. And when I see that, I'm like, wow. Yeah. Right? So I think he achieved a lot, and he sort of like lived in alignment with meaning to a greater extent than some Netflix show. Right. So the expression and the realization differs across cultures, and that's a good question: which culture achieved the most? Right. And I don't think that's our culture. But it's actually important that the answer is the same across all time for all people, objectively speaking, independently of our preferences. Yeah. I feel you're being very authoritarian now. I'm very authoritarian on this, and I'm open to being wrong, but then you have to give me a reason for why this is the wrong answer. You can't just say that you feel differently. Then I'm unmoved. You have to give me a reason. Here's a question. I think this is from Instagram. Aristotle said that taking pride in one's achievements is the crown of all virtues. Is it not so that this pride and the potential for improvement result in happiness, and thus happiness is the meaning of life? Maybe, to some extent. So I certainly don't think happiness is the meaning of life. And I certainly don't think it is the meaning of life, even if pursuing meaning results in happiness. Because I think we can imagine scenarios where the two concepts come apart.
Mm-hmm.
And just imagining possible scenarios where they do come apart, where they don't coincide, shows that they're different. So it might be that, when you pursue something meaningful, you achieve a certain level of happiness. And certainly you can achieve happy moments. You paint a painting and you go, wow, that was great. I'm really happy for a little while. And then you're like, I have to improve on this. So it gives you happy moments.
Yeah.
But happiness in a more deep sense is sort of like a satisfaction or contentment with your situation or your life for a longer period of time. And you're sort of like happy about your situation. And it has to last a little bit. And that certainly doesn't need to lead to meaning. It's like my cat can be very happy. But I think my cat's existence isn't as meaningful as, Michelangelo's.
Well, I would rather have the ability to tackle problems than to feel happy.
So this was Socrates' point when he said, I would rather be an unhappy human than a happy pig.
Right.
And
don't say anymore. That's a good punchline. Okay. Let's see here. It starts with agreed. So I guess that's positive. I think this is also from Instagram. Failure and striving is a huge part of learning. What is Mr. Bøhn's take on failure and its role in improvement?
So that's actually a very good question. I like that question. Because in order to improve things in general, whatever it is, you need to, at least most people fail a lot. Or they don't succeed right away. And that's part of, so ironically, if you imagine a scenario, if you say, use painting as an example since we're here. If you're, so in one sense, it's more of a point to go on painting if you have a great potential for improvement, right? It's a bit ironic.
Right. More mistakes to be made.
If you're the best painter in the world, there is a point to go on painting, namely improving yourself, the painting, but it's harder for you to realize it. So the point is the same for both, right? Improve your painting, right? That's the same point for both, but one of them has a bigger potential for improvement. So in a sense, it's...
Well, I think then at least you're talking about what you call instrumental values, or what term did you use? I mean, one thing I remember Odd Nerdrum said to me very early was, I was striving with the self-portrait, and he said, don't worry, it gets much more difficult as you go along.
I mean, it's the same. I think it's the same with a lot of disciplines. Like when I was a student of philosophy, when I studied philosophy, there was so much to learn, right? Just to get an overview of what's going on. It took forever. And then when you sort of get that overview and you're sort of established, it's the details that you work so hard on.
Well, I guess at a certain point when you're really learning a lot, that's a ride. But then you get, it sort of flattens out. And
so
then for many people that can be a downer, right?
So the learning curve can be very steep when you're beginning. And that's when you're like, certainly have a lot of potential for improvement. But then when you get really good, it sort of like slows down a little bit. But I think it's important that the failure and the potential for improvement and the curve can be very steep at points. But I think it's important that the meaning for both is the same. Namely the potential for improvement. So I think that's exactly, so I worked a lot with the formula. The meaning of life is to improve things. There's a reason I say things, because it's supposed to be anything. And there's a reason I say improve the potential for improving things. For example, rather than the things you improve. Because, so this is, it sounds sloppy, but it's very precise. Because it's actually the potential for improvement that's the same for both. So when you reach a level where there's no more potential for improvement, it becomes pointless to go on. That's the important part. And I think you never get there. Even like Odd Nerdrum, he still has room for improvement in painting. Otherwise, there would be no point for him to go on.
Right. Okay. Before we get into the whole idea of modernism, I have to remember to tell our audience that if you go to patreon.com/caveofapelles, you can see the different benefits you get from supporting our show, among them having your name mentioned when you ask questions. So, we're going to rip modernism apart, or rather, I'm leaving it up to you. You say, you wrote, that's the first thing I read from you, this article where you talk about portraiture, and I guess you talk about modernism there too. I guess that's where you really are more precisely directed at modernism and what it does to objective criteria. You want to lay that case out for us?
Yeah, so this is when things are going to go downhill. This is when we're going to start getting hate emails. I think, first of all, I think it's very important, very difficult to define modernism. I think it's a very fishy, foggy, hairy term. All these isms, I'm in general very skeptical of isms. But I think if we think of modernism,
yeah.
If we think of it as a tendency or a trend, and you can mention names. I'm going to try not to mention names. You can mention names if you want. But I want to describe a tendency, I think, that happened or really kicked in at the end of the 1800s, beginning of 1900s, in art and in culture more generally, actually. And the tendency was to, for example, in painting, to start questioning the tradition of painting,
right?
And start questioning the foundational rules, and start questioning the way of doing it, and try to provoke and do it in another way, or try to just question what I would call the axioms of painting, the foundational rules.
Sure.
So Picasso would be a paradigm example. I just mentioned his name. I said I shouldn't. Picasso would be a paradigm example, but even before and after him. But Picasso would be a paradigm example in painting. Schoenberg would be a paradigm example in music. I think James Joyce with Ulysses would be a paradigm example in literature, where they started to question so James Joyce wrote, Stream of Consciousness in a very different way from the traditional novel, and Picasso painting, perspectives have several different viewer points in the same painting in a different way than the tradition. He started to question these foundational rules of how to paint. And that's interesting. I sort of like people who rebel and object and do new things and provoke, and I have nothing against that. But my problem is that when the tendency to do that takes over and becomes the mainstream trend, that's when weird things start to happen, I think. Because in order to be corrected in a tradition, you need to have reference points over time. You need to look at other painters. You need to look at the ones you think are the best and to compare yourself so you can be corrected up against something.
Right.
But when all those traditional...
Potential for improvement.
Potential for improvement. I can improve towards Rembrandt style. I can improve towards, Odd Nerdrum style.
And if I can interject one thing there, I mean, this is something that I really became clear for me like the last year, and I've been doing painting courses for quite a few years. But then it's like suddenly you get this one sentence that you've been thinking about all the time, but you haven't really formulated it as well, as clearly. And the thing is that when I teach them how to paint, I'm not teaching them my style or Nerdrum style or Rembrandt style, but I'm teaching them the techniques that objectively work.
Yeah.
Right, and those are the things that are doubted.
And that's how you as a teacher can tell your students that you should improve this.
Yeah,
you should do this in order to get that result.
Right.
And you can correct them. Now, if your students were what I would call modernists, if they were like there to question the tradition, it would be very hard to evaluate their work.
Yeah,
because you wouldn't have any criteria to compare to. So the foundations would be ripped apart, and then you would be like, okay, so how do I judge this artwork? Well, now it becomes more a matter of, do I like it or not?
Right.
Is it satisfying to me? Do I like the colors? You can say general things. Is it stimulating my thoughts, or is it provocative? You can talk about it in many ways, but it's very hard to say that this painting is objectively better than this. So for example, take a purely abstract painting like Rothko, for example, and take a Picasso and take a Rembrandt. Which is the best? If I have no criteria or tradition to build on, I don't know how to answer that question. I could say which one I like the most, but that's sort of irrelevant to whether it's a good painting. Yeah, I think it's very important to separate whether the painting is good from whether I like it. Right. And when the trend becomes that we all evaluate it in terms of whether we like it or not, or whether it's interesting, or these very general terms that has nothing to do with what we talked about earlier, the Tëchne, it becomes really hard to evaluate. So the objectivity in the value judgments sort of fall apart.
And I know now from beforehand that you were not so particularly keen on going too much into Immanuel Kant, but I can't help myself. I mean, his whole idea is that you are the person who create beauty. It happens in you, right? And that subjectivity, I think, is the fundamental problem for talking about any kind of objectivity. And this is from this book on Munch. And I just want to sort of add to that, to the definition of modernism. And it's just some very few short quotes here, where they're talking about the naturalist generation. So it starts before modernism proper. Were actively against the academic type of painting. And they were united in the belief in the artist individual as a subjective unity. And then elsewhere here, they were talking about the subjective anchoring of perception in the artist individual. Right, so then you get to the situation where if like Munch said, people don't understand that the sky can be experienced as green, right? So this is my answer, that when subjectivism comes in, and this plays right into the hand of what you're writing there, and that's what I loved about your book, that you agree with me. Okay, joke aside, when subjectivism comes in, then you have no ability to say this is good or bad, and then everything just falls apart, right?
Yeah. So I mean, it's the same if you go back to subjective, objective meanings. If you say I experience it's meaningful to do this, and I say, well, I don't. Right. There's no way for me to correct you unless there's some objectivity to what's actually meaningful. Yeah. So if it was all just preferences and all just subjective experiences, I could never actually even communicate with you about the quality of your work, because you would experience something and there's nothing you can point to be corrected, because it's all about your experience.
Yeah, and the extreme case of that is, I don't know if you read, it's a wonderful book, The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie, about how the Christians and the destruction of the classical world, burning of books, destroying sculptures, etc. And coming in there, and we are talking about one of the most amazing things created in human history, and they just destroyed it without thinking. And I think that shows how important the conditioning of your whole metaphysics, your whole attitude, your sense of life, as Rand would say, is, and how that can cloud your ability to see what are objective qualities. But as I understood from your book, you're saying that, well, that still doesn't mean that what they don't see is not objectively good, right?
Yeah. So I think it's very important to separate the subjective experience or how much I like something from whether it's good.
Yeah. Or how much I dislike.
Yeah. So I have there are a bunch of modern artists that I really like and enjoy watching. And there are others I don't like and don't enjoy watching. But I think it's very important to separate that from whether they're actually good.
Yeah.
So there are many things I like to do which I recognize aren't the best thing to do.
Right.
It's like speeding with my car. I love speeding, but I recognize that it's not a good thing to do. And now I can't say because I love speeding, we should speed. I mean, it's a mistake. Right. And I think the same goes for art. There are some artists that I really like, but I also recognize that they're not the greatest artists. The work aren't the greatest.
What do you say about, there's one thing that Thomas Kolka writes about in his book Kitchen Art, which I could also recommend for you to read. And he talks about Les Damoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso. And he says that had it not had an effect art historically, it wouldn't have been a good painting.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking, well, what about the objective qualities? Are they completely non-existent? And I think that's when you come into the whole, well, modernist or art way of thinking, where it's not the objective quality of the work itself, but it is the reception.
Yeah, so one way of putting it is to tie it back to what we talked about earlier, is to say that when you think of the concept of Tëchne, you think of the objective instrumental skills and objectivity in instrumental skills needed, combined with the reasons why the values you want to express, the goal of your activity. And a lot of the tendency in modernism is to not worry too much about the instrumental objectivity or the technical skills needed to achieve something. and worry more about, values you want to express. It becomes more a play with ideas. So you sort of like remove half of the full-blown Tëchne concept,
Right.
and it becomes more an intellectual game. And which other artists can you refer to by doing this, or what do you want to? How can I provoke independently of perfecting my skills? It becomes a play with ideas. And when I go to an art show and I see a painting which is just a bunch of play with ideas or commentary on the contemporary political situation or something like that, I'm more like, I would rather read a doctoral dissertation on contemporary politics than watch that painting.
Right. But that's what I want.
It sort of loses its point, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's a crucial issue, because you say, okay, they lose the instrumental, like the technical aspect, the craft, to say it simply. But as far as I can see, they're losing the other half too. So if craft represents objective criteria for quality, then, and we were talking about, at least that is my view, that the eternal archetypical images, that it relates to archetypical situation, then that is the objectivity when it comes to the content. Then they are taking that away as well. So you have neither left. Yeah. And I think a central point for when art really becomes full-scale art with what we call modernism, I don't see a discontinuation. I just see it as the same thing going on, but just unfolding. Then one of the other basic premises besides the subjectivism is doubting, as you would say, mimesis. And then you are talking about the two aspects, because there's a painter friend of mine, Luke Hillestad, who wrote about that, how Aristotle is talking about mimesis not just of the outer form, but of the human mind, right? And that's the content, and you have the technical aspect and the content, right? Yeah,
but I'm not sure. I wouldn't rule out that some modernistic artwork can express a universal, eternal human state, or be able to do it. But I think it becomes just something very different from what you would express through painting, or
like Herman Brock says, no art can do without a drop of kitsch.
Yeah, but also it depends on like how narrow the ideas are. So like if the some kind of artwork is mainly referring to the contemporary political situation or the climate crisis, and that's the main point of the artwork, that could be good and interesting in one way, but it's just not going to last for very long. So it becomes less interesting in another way. The best you want to do is to achieve something that will last forever, for everyone, everywhere.
And am I quoting you correctly when I say that you're saying that with modernism, the improvement potential withers?
Yeah, so it becomes harder to evaluate how to improve, basically. Yeah. So a nice analogy is in mathematics, actually. So in mathematics, you have often what's called axiomatic systems. So that means you have some basic statements that you take for granted, and then you prove things from those. So for example, in number theory, you have some basic statements like 0 is a number, and 0 is a natural number. Every natural number has a successor, for example. Two statements, you accept them, and then you prove things. For example, 0 is a number, every number has a successor. Okay, so 0 has a successor. Let's call it 1. So then we have 0 and 1 all of a sudden being numbers. Then you can go on infinity and get all the numbers. Very simple, very nice deduction. Now imagine some modernist in mathematics came in and said, well, I'm going to question those two statements. Okay, good, interesting. And what are we going to do now? We can't prove anything now. So it's an objective fact.
So the whole endeavor becomes meaningless.
Yeah, because it might, he might establish a new tradition, and they do often in mathematics too. They talk about imaginary numbers or real numbers, and they talk about other numbers, and they can do that and establish new traditions. But if the main trend is just to question the foundational statements all the time, then you can't show anything.
Well, it's like discussing with someone and the person doesn't want to agree with you.
Yeah, it's fruitless. Yeah. It's pointless to keep going. So if someone denied those two statements in number theory, I couldn't show them that 1 is a number.
Right.
Because it wouldn't follow, because they denied the foundation. But nonetheless, 1 is a number. given those two statements. That's just objectively provable. And if you feel differently, you're just confused.
Right.
I just proved it to you right now.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's like then you're talking about what Aristotle, he refers to the sick eye, right? Who sees a different color. What's the exact example? The eye sees a different color than what is actually there. Well, that just means that the eye is sick, not that the color is like that for me and like that for you, right?
Yeah, I mean, or it might just be a different tradition altogether. So I mean, so in
well, I mean, the irony is that modernism has, of course, an idea of objective truth. Like you have Malevich, the black square, which he said was the essence of Rembrandt, and then you're sort of really being objective about, okay, that Rembrandt is black, so why don't you just paint black, right? Or paint is the modernist idea. Yeah. So they see that as a sort of objectivity. But then again, you lose the fact that what you do, if it doesn't relate to the human existence, it's not interesting for human beings. And you create out of the fact of being a human being, not being a fly or living on Mars or whatever.
I think another big problem with modernist tendency is that when you go away from the skills involved in Tëchne, when you go away from gaining a craft or gaining the ability to perform something really well, like paint really well, when you don't think about that, but you think more about playing with ideas, we're sort of losing something that makes humans a great thing. I mean, we're losing the ability to show that we can actually make some really impressive stuff. And when you move away from the skills, it's sort of like we lose that incredibly amazing feature that we saw in the High Renaissance, for example. The craftsmanship was just wow. Yeah. And that shows something about humanity and about us. Yeah. And when we all want to just provoke, or all want to just do creative things, or all just want to have fun, or we just want to be entertained, it's sort of like it's a decay of what it is that we can actually do. So I think an analogy to modernism or modernistic tendencies is, being a teenager. So when you're a teenager, you want to find yourself, you want to provoke, and you want to test out all kinds of options, and that's good, that's healthy, but imagine being 40, 50 years old and you're still doing that. Then it's sort of like it's not that healthy anymore.
No, that's just sad. Yeah.
You sort of want to find back to what's really important. What are the more objective values that we should be corrected towards, and not just provoke for the sake of provoking, or being original for the sake of being original, or trying to find yourself just for the sake of finding something unique. You sort of want to find back to what you think is really valuable. Really important. And that's sort of a trend. Is dangerous when the teenage attitude becomes mainstream instead of vice versa. I think the teenage attitude is healthy as a sidekick, as to keep us fresh and self-reflexive and so on. But it's not healthy when it becomes mainstream. Right. When it becomes the most important thing.
And I think what I see as one major problem, the consequence of this. I mean, we talked about initially, how do you keep yourself up mentally as a figurative painter? You achieve really high level of skill, and precisely achieving that is seen as your worst quality. And how do you reconcile that dissonance there? And especially because the consequence of the subjectivism of the art way of thinking is nepotism, right? There are no objective criteria to go by, so it's a matter of what we feel at present is the zeitgeist, is the spirit of our times. And then you get to, I always use the example of Ilya Repin. He could become the greatest Russian painter, even though he was not of noble descent. In the military, you had to be noble to become a general. But because there were objective criteria, this looks like a cloak, not as color, these proportions are correct, all these things. Because of that, he, coming from, at least not the highest levels of society, could become famous. And that, to me, is justice. That is a fair, a moral situation to live in. And you don't get that with the subjectivism of art.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what we talked about earlier, like to recognize and value skills and craftsmanship, and to recognize and value when people are really good at something. And that takes...
And then you need to change or give them an alternative of a way of thinking. I mean, if you have an ideology that says it's bad to be good, then of course you don't get that.
Yeah, but I mean, I think a lot of modern artists would also think that they are improving and they are good at what they do and they become better. And I think there's even truth to that many times, that they are actually improving, given certain predefined notions of what you want to achieve.
Right.
But I think the danger is when we don't value the longer traditions, when the reference points for being corrected isn't, eternal, but they're more narrow to your local present or to your own century even, then it becomes much less of a it becomes less great.
Less eternal.
No, but it becomes more less room for objectivity, right?
Yeah.
It becomes less room for
comparing
yourself to others, and that takes away a lot of the point of going on. It becomes very local and very a cycle of self-reflection that doesn't reach out to height and depth.
I think this is why
humans can reach out to do.
I think this is why Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish, I guess he was a sociologist, he wrote in English, The Dehumanization of Art. It sounds polemic, but it's not. He's quite positive about it, and he talks about how art, and as he says, consciously moves away from what is recognizable for you as a human being. But then I'm thinking, okay, there's several things here. One is the whole idea of zeitgeist. We are doing this at present, which is a horrible admittal of complete lack of individuality, of courage to stand on your own, right? And the other thing is that when an artist or a modernist ridicules an academic painter, oh, that's what they did at that time. Well, he's laughing at himself because he's standing in the same idea that you have to be in your time. So in 100 years, he will be ridiculous, right? So
it's like fashion.
Yeah. But then you lose the eternally valid, objective, I would say, valid criteria for what is appealing.
Yeah. I mean, so I think it's very simple. You compare two scenarios. You compare a scenario where so take a painter, two painters. One of them exhibits, not only works really hard, both of them work really hard, say, but one of them exhibits great skills in the sense of like knowing how to paint what he wants to paint, and he shows great skills in actual just techniques of painting. And he exhibits universal human values that are eternal, that everyone can recognize independently of time and space. Even if they're shaped in a contemporary, clothings, they might still be recognizable as universal and eternal. And on the other hand, you have a painter who also worked really hard and who have skills and can even improve some of his skills, but it's mostly a work that is trying to improve his contemporary art, reference to contemporary artists or contemporary zeitgeist. And in 100 years, no one will recognize what the point was unless they read a book telling them what the point was. Compare the two and say, which one's better? And not just which one do I like the most, but which one's actually better? Which one exhibits more of the greatness of mankind? The one with the amazing skills and eternal values, or the one with, creative, original skills and local values? I think both have their value. I think a lot of people appreciate both in different ways, but more objectively speaking, like independently of what we prefer and like, which one's just better? And I think it's pretty obvious. I'm not going to answer it. We're going to leave the question in the air, but I think it's an important question.
There are quite a few other things we could talk about, but I love that punchline to a degree where I'm going to tell you it was a joy to have you on the show. And
joy to be here.
And thank you for watching. Remember, you can support our show at patreon.com/caveofapellis. I'll see you next month. you.